All right, I can't help it. We'll go ahead and get started.
Sure. After a few stuttered attempts here, we'll go ahead and get started.
After you scream at G Money or whatever.
Listen, we don't need to reference the prior attempt. There's no need for that.
It was hysterical. So, again, thanks for coming out here. I know it's a bit of a drive for you. Right now, I am speaking with Chad, my youngest brother. In the first episode, we talked to the second brother, which is Cyril. The biggest reason why I wanted to talk to you today, and the thing that I hear the most from both of our significant others, is that for whatever reason, apparently we have very similar outlooks on life, meaning, and purpose, and how sometimes it drives us to a, let's call it a mildly nihilistic state from time to time, where you start questioning a lot of things. What are you doing? Why are you doing it? Where am I going? That type of thing. And what intrigues me about that is although we have similar questions, I think we go about it in different ways. And I think what's unique about it is, I shouldn't say that it's unique. It's not. I think most people have the same questions we do, and I just want to take the opportunity to see how it is that you kind of work through those mental exercises, whether it be your relationship, whether it's work, whatever it is that you tend to be, and I tend to get like kind of nihilistic or skittish about, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Sure. I mean, it's a lot to unpack here for sure. I guess my first, what do you mean by nihilistic is what I would ask.
So when you stop there, you look up at the night sky, for example, and you might be a little drunk, maybe a little,
Sure.
Medicated, let's say.
Sure.
Sometimes there seems to be a moment that strikes you that's like, hey, shit, like this is a lot. Life is a lot. There's a lot going on. I'm not sure what the hell I'm doing or where I'm going.
Yeah.
And for me, it generally applies to my job, and it happens in about 1.5 to 2 year cycles where I do something professionally for about that amount of time when I feel like I've learned everything I can learn and there's nothing left to learn, and I'm no longer making the impact that I thought I would make, and I become disillusioned with what I'm doing, and then that's where all the questions start rolling in. Well, if this job, like I can't do this job for the next 30, 40 years until I retire. There's no way. I'll fucking shoot myself. But then it leads into other questions. Well, if I can't do this for 30 or 40 years, well, what the hell am I going to do? And then you start weighing your options, and then that's when you feel like you realize, wait a minute, I don't have necessarily a college-level education. I don't have doors open to me that other people might. I got kids to feed. Right. I mean,
I got health insurance.
All of a sudden, you're on this downhill spiral where you're just like, I don't know what I'm doing right now.
Yeah.
And this is scary as fuck. And although the difference, I think, for you is obviously you don't have kids and you aren't as old as I am at this point, but I feel like there's very similar kind of thought processes to what am I doing?
Just to be clear, I will never be as old as you are at any given point. Just to be clear. Sure. Consequences of mathematics, for sure. Yeah, it is interesting because, well, for me, let's rewind it a bit, right? For me, it starts at worldview. It starts at your base level understanding of what the universe is, of what reality is, of what the human experience is, right? And what you believe about those things, to me, underpins your day-to-day, or your week-to-week, or your month-to-month. And it's interesting because we both grew up Baptist Christian.
Yeah.
And I don't know when you shed that belief. I shed that belief. Go ahead. I'm interested to hear it because I remember specifically, I'll say this. When you were joining the military, you were 17, I believe. Mm-hmm. And they asked you to list a religious belief, which is interesting. I don't know why that's necessary.
Burial purposes.
Okay, fair enough. That's a little morbid, but practical. That makes sense.
I mean...
Yeah. Especially for combat. I mean, come on. But you listed non-affiliation?
I listed non-denominational.
Non-denominational, what does that mean?
That means essentially Protestant, but not a specific, I'm not Baptist or Methodist or, all the other ones that are out there. It's just more I'm Protestant.
So at the time, I totally misunderstood that.
Sure.
Because I remember mom and dad making a little bit of a deal about it. Mm-hmm. and I assumed it meant you were non-religious.
So originally, I was going to go with no affiliation.
Okay.
And that was where the pushback kind of occurred. And
from mom and dad?
From mom and dad. From specifically mom.
Right.
And that's where the agreement is fine, I'll put non-denominational instead of Baptist, which is what mom is.
Wow, I'm glad we corrected that. I've been wrong about that for like 12 years.
Well, you're not necessarily wrong, because that was the original thought, was for me to put no affiliation. Sure. Because at the time...
Is that how you felt at the time, at 17?
Yes.
That you were irreligious, or you were just... not particularly
then religious? I was irreligious.
Okay.
So you weren't entirely wrong.
Okay.
What you were wrong about was the non-denominational as opposed to non-affiliated. At that time, I didn't know what atheism was. I didn't know what agnostic was. I wasn't really well-versed in what it meant to not have a religion. What I was, for a 17-year-old, versed in was religions like Islam, Buddhism, obviously all the sects of Christianity, and that's because of our father.
Yes,
he was very open about
both of them, but Dad was the real driver of like, yo, get up at 6 a.m. We're having devotion on a Wednesday, and it's like, can I just sleep in, please?
To his credit, though, he also was, hey, look at some other ones.
I don't remember that.
He did for me, and that might have just been situational. That might have been him recognizing that I'm not about this. This ain't for me. So I think for him it was, all right, fine. Then instead of telling you this is the religion, I'm going to let you look at other religions and determine for yourself that my religion is still the right religion.
I will give him credit for that then.
I think the goal was for me to cycle back to Baptist.
Sure.
By virtue of showing you how wrong everything else is.
Take a tour.
So I don't want to give him too much credit.
Sure.
But I remember he showed me a book on what was it, Taoism? I do remember reading briefly about Buddhism. I do remember reading quite a bit about Islam. And the reason for that was because I was joining the Army in high school. So I officially joined the Army this summer going into my senior year. So I spent senior year reading a lot about Islam because I figured I would be deploying to Iraq. Like, that was the assumption. Okay, so I might as well become a little more versed in that religion.
Okay.
So that's kind of where that came from. But at the time, I didn't understand atheism or, being agnostic, for example.
Okay. So when would you say that you... Because I don't know how you would define yourself right now. But for me, and I've spent way, way, way too much time and energy into developing what it is I believe and how I would define myself. Okay. And definitions are fairly arbitrary. You get more into the meat of something when you truly ask somebody what exactly they believe. But if I were to define myself right now, I would say first and foremost, I'm a secular humanist. And secondly, I am an agnostic atheist. So if you want me to break those down for you, I can.
Yeah.
So secular humanist, secular obviously meaning worldly. I don't place any value in anything that's superstitious. I don't place anything value into anything you would consider supernatural. For me, I'm very evidence-based. And if you ask me to ultimately place belief into what it is you're trying to sell me, I'm going to tell you to go away.
Okay.
But humanism is essentially the belief that human beings are complex and they have a lot of potential, and the focus should be on maximizing that potential, as far as I understand it.
Okay.
Secondly, agnostic atheist. Agnosticism is a position of this is... it's essentially a consideration on whether or not you can know something. It's a philosophical term, right? Okay. Agnosticism is it's a position on knowledge, right? The early philosophers, Jesus Christ, they were
ironic you say Jesus Christ.
Okay. Maybe I am Christian. They were concerned with how can you know what you know, right? There's this whole brain in the vat type of idea, like the Matrix, right? You don't know that you know the things around you. You can only know that yourself is aware, right? But philosophers were concerned about how you know knowledge. And for me, like, or technically, agnosticism is a position on knowledge. So for me, I don't know that atheism is correct, but it's a position that, oh God, how do I describe this? I've spent so much time and energy, like, involving myself in these fields that I should be more well-versed, but it is essentially a position on knowledge. So I don't know that there is no God, but for me, the default position is that you could probably assume that there's not, but I don't know that there's not. So agnosticism is acknowledging that you cannot know that position, but it's also, like, for me, the default position is that there probably is not a God.
So that's crazy as shit, first of all.
Okay, go ahead.
Because you have spent, obviously, a lot of time
trying
to figure out. That's where I disagree with you.
Because there's agnosticism and then there's Gnosticism. Because people will say, like, oh, you don't know that there's a God, you're agnostic. No, that's not how it works. Agnosticism is a position on whether or not you know what you know. So Gnostics claim to know that they know. Agnostics claim that they know, but they're not sure that they know, essentially.
Right. So that makes sense. That makes sense.
You're telling me I'm crazy. Go ahead. Tell me why I'm crazy.
Well, first off, I want to say that I applaud you for the amount of time you spent thinking about it, because I don't think enough people tried it. Because here's why. Here's why.
Sure.
To me.
Sure.
You can't take that next step in figuring out yourself without going and trying to answer those questions for yourself. And the fact of the matter is that you, being different than me, being different than anybody else, is going to potentially take more time to figure that out for yourself. But the fact that you're taking those steps and you're making the effort to try to figure that out, I believe, is the most important thing. Because if you're not trying, what are you doing?
I agree.
Right?
Truth should be the ultimate pursuit.
For me, my current perspective... So let me back up a little bit to your first question.
Well, I was going to say, I define myself, so how do you define yourself?
I don't have a definition.
Okay.
Right? So you've spent a lot of time, it seems like, trying to fit your belief structure into the current known definitions of religions, right? You've come up with secular humanism.
I would say philosophy, but sure.
Okay,
yes.
That's fine.
Yep.
I have not spent the time you have spent in the language, if you will, of what things are. What I do currently believe right now is that God, in and of itself, is you. You can only know yourself, and God is only the best version of yourself. And you have to take the time and effort to try to figure out what that actually means to you. So what is the best version of yourself? Is it your pursuit in your job, your professional life, your personal life? Is it the best version? Like, what is the best version of you ultimately? Now, what I do to try to achieve that is I take the time, or try to take the time, to read and study about different humans and even fictional people throughout history.
Sure.
And I take certain aspects of those people that I like, and I move that into what I try to achieve for myself. So for an example, what I would say is Theodore Roosevelt. You've known me.
Yeah.
You've known me forever, obviously. Since
please, I love Teddy Roosevelt.
The number one thing that I take from Teddy Roosevelt that I want to try to strive and achieve every single day is something called the strenuous life. Putting yourself through these, whether they be mental exercises, whether they be physical exercises, but continuing to push the boundary of what is stressful to yourself and your body. So number one, physically, you get to a point to where, you might not be able to only run a mile today, but if you continue to push that boundary and continue to push and push and push, at some point you're going to grow, and you can only grow through stress.
So there's value in stressing the self.
Correct. The problem that we have today is that we all view stress in the wrong light. So stress for a lot of people right now is paying the bills. It's
negative.
Right. It's paying the bills. It's getting my work done at job. It's whether or not I get laid off. It's things like that.
Whether or not I get laid.
Even that, sure.
Sure.
What I'm talking about with stress is, what am I doing to continue to challenge my mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical capacity? Because without pushing those boundaries, I don't know who I am. If I sit on the couch every single day, I'm never going to know whether or not I could run a marathon. If I never read that 500-page book, I'm never going to know what I don't know out of that book. I got to take the time, and I've got to push myself, and it's going to be hard, right? But without that difficulty, it's not worth achieving. So that's just one kind of tiny aspect that I'm going to take from somebody like Teddy Roosevelt, and I'm going to try to apply to my life to become the best version of myself. And to me, God, quote unquote, is the best version of you. That's what you're always striving to achieve.
So this is where I'm going to try and pick it apart.
Okay.
Because I like that.
Sure.
I understand that definition. God is like this maximal ideal of, and I would say not only the self, but of society as a whole.
Okay. I stop at self because...
That's fair.
Until I figure out myself, there's no way I'm impacting society.
Sure. That's
just
fair.
me.
That's fair. But my question would be, do you believe in a literal God? Or a literal afterlife? Or a literal soul? Because you mentioned to me that, like, okay, let's sit down, let's talk about meaning and purpose.
Yeah.
Right? These are very relevant questions to me. So, I understand that you have a functioning idea of, like, okay, that's what God is to me, and, like, that's how I can maximize my well-being or myself or whatever you want to call it. But, like, do you have a literal belief in a higher power? Do you have a literal belief in some sort of conservation of the self after death? Like, where is your definition that falls into that category? Because to me, that, like, as coming into this conversation, and, like, this is, this could be just for me, but those questions are very pertinent in terms of meaning and purpose.
Sure. I'll disagree with you on that because I don't think you need to know. Well, I guess that's not necessarily what you're saying either. You're not saying that you need to know that there is or isn't a God in order to derive
But your
meaning and
position on whether or not those things are true or not true. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Have you considered these things? Do you ask these questions? Do you not?
I try to, right?
Okay,
and the whole point of this podcast, for me, right, it's called Caleb versus Self. It's for me to have conversations so that I continue to push the boundaries of what I know and what I understand.
Sure.
Right? Obviously, iron sharpens iron, steel sharpens steel. If you're not having these difficult conversations, you're never going to figure out what you don't know.
True.
So,
and I respect that.
To that point, right now, I do not believe in a literal God. I don't believe in...
Preservation of the self, any sort of idea of the soul?
Not currently.
Okay.
Not currently.
It's interesting that you leave that door open, because you say not currently.
So the reason why I continue to leave that door open...
That implies like a little bit of hesitation.
Absolutely, but how many people in your life have you met that are 100% certain?
Well, I don't want to meet those people. Yeah, exactly. I don't.
So I will always leave that door cracked open.
I respect that.
But right now, if you're going to ask me flat out, I don't believe in that.
Because for me, when you talk about meaning and purpose, and like, so Jordan Peterson is one of, when I was trying to flesh out the ideas I have about this topic, and again, like, I've spent way too much time considering these things. Jordan Peterson is a name that comes up a lot for me because he talks a lot about meaning and purpose, but he talks about it in a context of a literal God that implores us to be our best self. You know what I mean? Like, and I do think it matters. The reason I like Jordan Peterson, and I don't like the fact that he's religious, but I understand where he's coming from. Because, like, okay, consider the fact that more and more American society, European society, I would say most societies are becoming more irreligious in general.
Yeah.
We're sort of, like, slowly divorcing ourselves from these religions. What kind of impact does that have on society in general? And is that a positive or negative impact, right? If there is no ultimate grounded sort of like preservation type meaning in terms of the self, in terms of society, are you left with anything that's tangible when that goes away? Like, for me, like, we're slowly phasing out religion. And let's talk about America in particular.
Sure.
That's
we live here.
Yeah. We are Americans. It seems to me that, like, when religion sort of slowly gets pushed out, people are pushed more towards the instant gratification. People are pushed more towards the pleasures every day. And there's less of the self-sacrifice. There's less of the let me sacrifice my comfort of today to have a better next month, better next year.
Would you say that we are losing the strenuous life?
Yeah. Yes. You're right. Yes.
For me, because that's where it matches right into what you're talking about.
So for you, like, the strenuous life is irreligious. It is just an acknowledgement of a sacrifice of the pleasure of today for the betterment of next month or next year or what have you, or next week or tomorrow even. But it seems that when you root that in religion, when you root that in, like, there was this creator who knows you personally, created you, sent you down here, you have a purpose. You know what I mean? When you discard all of that underpinning, does that detract from being able to have a strenuous life? Right? Or no?
I don't think it does.
You don't think it does?
No.
Do you think for the general populace it does?
I think, to answer your question, or to kind of continue on that path, I think the problem is as you get rid of religion, we have to go through a learning curve, right? As humans, when was the last time we were without religion?
When we were nomadic.
There's going to be a steep learning curve, right?
Sure,
and typically at the beginning of any large change is going to be a negative curve. So right now, because that's not a thing,
I hear you.
There's going to be a quick move to like instant gratification. There's going to be the move to being
happy
slothful,
right now,
gluttonous,
sure.
all the 7 deadly sins in some kind of weird way, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think as time goes on, as the next generation comes or the next one comes after that, they're going to look back and be like, you guys literally didn't have a purpose. You didn't do shit.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what did you do as a generation? And those people are going to go back and look and say, okay, how can we derive purpose and meaning without religion, without a God, if you will? And I think what you're ultimately going to find, like 100 years from now, maybe 1,000 years from now, I don't know. I'm an idiot that's talking in my basement, so what the fuck do I know?
Sure.
What I think, if I had to guess, is going to happen is ultimately they're going to be invested more in the society and in the group as a whole, and that's where they're going to derive that meaning, purpose, and identity from.